What happens when a little boy stands up in a courtroom and points straight at a police officer? What if the words that come out of his mouth shake the entire room? The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made everyone hold their breath. The judge, an older woman with gray hair and small glasses, sat behind her high desk, looking down at the people in the room. A police officer in a navy blue uniform stood confidently near the witness stand, his hands crossed in front of him. He had a smirk on his face, like he knew nothing could touch him. Then, out of nowhere, a little black boy stood up. He looked no older than 8, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. His big brown eyes were filled with something no one expected, fear, but also determination. He raised his hand and pointed straight at the police officer. "That's him," the boy shouted, his voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's the man who took my dad away. He lied." Gasps filled the courtroom. The officer's smirk disappeared. The judge's eyebrows raised. The boy's mother, sitting beside him, grabbed his arm. "Jaden, sit down," she whispered, her voice desperate. But Jaden didn't move. The officer's face turned pale. "I don't know what this kid is talking about," he said quickly. "He must be confused." Jaden shook his head hard. "No. I remember. You took my dad, and he didn't do anything wrong. You lied." The courtroom exploded into whispers. The judge banged her gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" But no one could ignore what had just happened. Jaden's mom pulled him down into his seat, but it was too late. The courtroom had already changed. Everyone was staring at the police officer now, waiting for him to explain. Just an hour earlier, the case had seemed simple. Jaden's father, Marcus Lewis, had been arrested 2 months ago for a crime he swore he didn't commit. The police reports said he had robbed a liquor store, but there was no real evidence, just the word of one officer, Officer Bradley Thomas. That same officer now stood in court, looking uncomfortable under the weight of Jaden's little finger pointed at him like a knife. Before Jaden's outburst, the case had been going badly for Marcus. The prosecutor had made him sound guilty, twisting words and making it seem like there was no mistake. Marcus had been sitting quietly, his hands clenched in his lap, looking at the floor. But now, after his son's words, he lifted his head. His eyes locked onto the officers, and for the first time that day, something shifted. Officer Thomas cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I—" "Wait," the judge interrupted. She turned to Jaden. "Young man, what do you mean when you say he lied?" Jaden's chest rose and fell quickly. He looked at his mom, who was shaking her head, silently begging him not to say more. But the boy swallowed hard and spoke. "I was there," Jaden said. "That night when my dad was arrested. I was in the car." He turned his eyes to the officer. "You told him if he gave you money, you'd let him go." Another wave of gasps. Officer Thomas's face turned red. "That's ridiculous," he shouted. "This is a child. He doesn't know what he's saying." Jaden's lips trembled, but he didn't stop. "You said if he didn't pay you, you'd make up something to put him in jail." His voice cracked. "And you did." The judge's face turned unreadable. She leaned forward. "Is this true, Officer Thomas?" The officer looked like a cornered animal. He shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Your Honor, this is insane." The boy's just scared. "His father is a criminal, and now he's trying to make me the bad guy." Jaden's mother wrapped her arms around her son, holding him close. Marcus sat frozen, his breathing shallow. The judge sighed and rubbed her temples. "Mr. Lewis," she said, looking at Marcus, "did you know about this?" Marcus opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in a dark suit rushed inside, holding a folder. "Your Honor," the man called out. I have new evidence that changes everything. The entire room spun toward him. The officer's hands twitched at his sides. The judge squinted. "What kind of evidence?" she asked. The man walked toward the judge's bench, his shoes clicking loudly against the floor. He placed the folder down and opened it. Inside were photographs of grainy, black and white security footage. He flipped one of the pictures around for the judge to see. Her eyes widened. Officer Thomas took a step back. The judge's fingers tightened around her gavel. "This changes everything," she murmured. Then, she looked up at Marcus, at Jaden, at the police officer. And then she spoke words that no one in that courtroom expected. Could a single piece of evidence be enough to expose the truth? And if it did, what would happen to the officer who had been so confident just moments ago? The judge's voice was steady, but her eyes were filled with something new, something dangerous. "This security footage shows the real events of that night," she announced. "Officer Thomas, do you have anything to say before I play this for the courtroom?" Officer Thomas's face twisted. "Your Honor, this is highly unusual. That evidence was not presented before trial." "It could be." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "This is a courtroom, not your personal playground, Officer Thomas. If this footage proves what this boy just said, we have a serious problem." She nodded at the man who had rushed in with the folder. He stepped to the side and pressed a button on a small device. A screen on the wall flickered to life. The room fell into dead silence as the grainy footage played. A street. A parked car. And then, a police cruiser pulling up behind it. Two officers stepped out, one of them clearly Officer Thomas. The other was blurred by the poor camera quality. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it was the night of Marcus Lewis' arrest. Then came the sound. "I can let you go," a voice said. The audio was scratchy, but it was unmistakably Officer Thomas's. "You just have to do me a favor." Marcus' voice was quiet but firm. "I don't have any money. I didn't do anything wrong." Officer Thomas's face, clear as day in the video, leaned closer. "Then I'm gonna make sure you regret that." Gasps filled the room. Jaden clutched his mother's hand. His father, Marcus, sat completely still, his jaw tight. Officer Thomas took a step back from where he stood. His forehead dripped with sweat. That's not real. This could be fake." The judge's stare was like ice. "Are you saying this is doctored footage, Officer Thomas?" The officer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was trapped. The judge turned back to the man who had brought the evidence. "Where did this footage come from?" The man adjusted his tie. "This was taken from a surveillance camera outside a local grocery store. It was overlooked during the initial investigation. My team discovered it this morning." The judge nodded. "And you can confirm it hasn't been tampered with?" "Yes, Your Honor," the man said firmly. Officer Thomas ran a hand through his hair. His confidence was crumbling. This doesn't mean anything." "Maybe I was." "You are extorting an innocent man," the judge said, her voice sharp. "And when he refused, you arrested him under false charges." The courtroom broke into whispers. A few people openly stared at the officer, disgusted. Jaden's mother pulled her son close, tears filling her eyes. Marcus, still frozen in his seat, slowly turned his head toward his son. Jaden had done it. His bravery had led to the truth coming out. Officer Thomas took a step toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor, I..." "Enough," she snapped. "This court will not tolerate corruption." She turned to the bailiff. "Take Officer Thomas into custody." The officer's face drained of color. "Wait, what?" "No! You can't do this." I was just doing my job. The bailiff stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs. Officer Thomas stumbled back, panic setting in. No, 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 this isn't happening. But before the bailiff could grab him, the officer did something no one expected. He bolted. Gasps echoed through the room as he ran toward the courtroom doors. The bailiff lunged after him, but the officer was fast. He pushed past people in the aisle, knocking over a man in a suit. The judge banged her gavel. Stop him! The courtroom erupted into chaos. People jumped up, some trying to move out of the way, others trying to block the officer's path. Jayden held onto his mother, his little heart pounding. Just as Officer Thomas reached the exit, the doors burst open again, this time, with more police officers flooding in. And then, a single gunshot rang out. Who fired the shot? And was someone hurt? The entire courtroom froze. The sound of the gunshot echoed against the walls, leaving a deafening silence behind. Jayden clutched his mother's arm, his tiny fingers digging into her sleeve. His father, Marcus, stood up so fast his chair toppled over. Then, the chaos returned. People screamed, ducking under benches. The judge banged her gavel, shouting for order, but no one listened. Officer Thomas had fallen to the floor near the courtroom doors. His body was shaking, his face twisted in pain. Blood pooled from his leg where the bullet had struck. A police officer stood above him, gun still drawn. Stay down, he barked. Don't move. Officer Thomas groaned, gripping his wounded leg. His once confident expression was now full of fear. I didn't mean. Didn't mean to run, the officer spat. Didn't mean to lie? Didn't mean to arrest an innocent man? You're done, Thomas. Two other officers rushed forward, yanking Thomas's arms behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The judge slammed her gavel again. This courtroom will have order. Slowly, people began to settle down. Some whispered to each other, others shook their heads in disbelief. Marcus was still standing, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked from Thomas to Jayden, then back at the officers. Jayden's mother wiped a tear from her eye, holding her son close. It's over, she whispered. It's finally over. The judge let out a heavy breath, looking at Marcus. Mr. Lewis, please come forward. Marcus hesitated before stepping toward the bench. His legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by everything he had been through. The judge straightened her robe. Based on the evidence presented today, it is clear you were wrongfully arrested. This court officially drops all charges against you. A wave of relief swept through the room. Marcus' shoulders sagged. After everything, after months of fear, after sitting in a jail cell, after almost losing hope, it was finally over. Jayden beamed, his eyes shining. His father was free. The judge continued. Furthermore, given the actions of Officer Thomas, an immediate investigation will be launched into any other cases he handled. If this is not the first time he abused his power, we will ensure justice is served. Officer Thomas, still on the floor, let out a bitter laugh. You think you've won? He muttered. This doesn't change anything. Marcus turned to face him, his expression unreadable. It changes everything. The officer shook his head. The system is bigger than you. You think one little boy's words make a difference? Jayden stepped forward before anyone could stop him. He looked Thomas right in the eye. My words told the truth, he said. And the truth always wins. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even the officers holding Thomas seemed taken aback. The judge nodded firmly. Bailiff, remove him from my courtroom. The officers dragged Thomas to his feet. He winced as he was pulled toward the door, his injured leg barely able to hold him up. The last thing he saw before being taken away was Jayden, standing tall, proud, and unshaken. Marcus turned to his son and bent down, his eyes filled with pride. "You saved me," he whispered. "You're my hero." Jaden smiled. "I just told the truth, Daddy." His mother hugged them both, fresh tears streaming down her face. People in the courtroom clapped, some wiping their own eyes. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the sun shone brightly in the sky. For the first time in months, Marcus felt free. And all because his little boy had the courage to point at a police officer in court and tell the truth.